Well, thank you very much, Ruth. Those who want us to remain in the EU, and henceforth I shall refer to them as the Romanians, because that is what indeed they are. The Romanians have made it very clear that they intend to deploy fear as their primary weapon, as Matthew so rightly said. And yet for me, it is the least credible element in their armoury. And we all know that Britain's national security is derived from two main sources: our armed forces and our intelligence services. And our international manifestation of those is NATO and the Five Eyes community, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. Which bits of these actually refer to the European Union, and therefore which part of our national security is damaged by being outside the European Union? In fact, what I hope to convince you is that in fact it would be stronger. Why does NATO matter to us? Because it's a community of 900 million people compared to the EU's 500 million people, but much more importantly, it brings the strength of the United States defense budget. And for those who don't know, the United States defense budget is bigger than the next 11 defense budgets in the world combined. Russia, China, Britain, France, it is a huge and important element for our national security. But NATO is more than that, because it also brings into our alliance countries that are geopolitically crucial to our security. Canada in the high north, Norway and Turkey, all of whom are outside the European Union. And the key element of our security in NATO is Article 5. Then an attack on one is an attack on all. That is what's maintained peace in Europe since World War II, not the European Union. And I imagine the Nobel Prize Committee will be giving their prize to the Atlantic next. Now they've gone down the route of giving it to the EU. But I mention Article 5 because the European Union could never provide us with that level of security for one minor reason: it's got 5 neutral countries in it. How do you provide an Article 5 type protection when you simply cannot give a guarantee that you will be involved should someone attack one of your allies? And I think that the European Union's whole approach to defence and security risks, in fact challenges, the primacy of NATO in terms of our defence. At the very least, it duplicates and diverts scarce resources at a time when too few of our allies are paying their way and contributing what they have already promised in terms of NATO. And since President Obama's name was brought up, the next time the American president wants to give us advice about remaining in the EU, which of course he's free to do, he can do it when he has an open border with Mexico and a Supreme Court that can override their own Supreme Court. And we'll wait for that moment. But the Americans need to understand that there is a pernicious anti-Americanism in a great deal of this policy to push EU defence. It is not just pushing the EU into the space, it's hopefully pushing the United States out. And that is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the threats we face in the world around us. Now, I think the European Union has actually done some very good things in terms of security policy over the years. It brought Spain and Greece and Portugal from military dictatorships to democratic nations in a short time. It acted as a beacon for some of those states that were under the Soviet yoke to come and wish to be pluralistic Western nations. The trouble is that the European Union has never come to terms with the fall of the Berlin Wall and has continued on the same trajectory, notwithstanding the fact that there are fundamentally different threats out there that need to be dealt with consistency and strength, the strength and consistency that only NATO can bring. And I was at a meeting with a former Prime Minister of one of our EU allies who said, you know, for our country, we don't think that we're really emotionally suited to be war fighters. We're more suited to be peacekeepers. And I had to point out to him that you can only be a peacekeeper if there's a peace to be kept. And sometimes if you want that peace, you have to fight for it, you certainly have to pay for it, and you sometimes have to die for it. And my worry about the whole push for EU defence is that it will give some of those countries an extra excuse not to be involved on the hard line, on the hard side of the hard power that NATO needs to project, and may lead them to believe they've got a softer role that doesn't involve them in what we've regarded as our traditional defence. And on top of that, now I don't need to tell anyone in this audience, in how many other areas of policy, when we've been told one day it's voluntary cooperation, that won't come under the auspices of the Commission or the Court, only to find a few months later that that's exactly what happens. I do not want my defence to be a supranational entity. I want us to cooperate with our other defence partners as sovereign nations, and only as sovereign nations. And a British exit from the European Union, in my view, will do one thing that will make NATO have a wake-up call. It will end the EU's defence pretensions, because it will mean that the remaining EU simply does not have the military capacity to pretend it can be an alternative to NATO. And that would be good for Britain, it'd be good for the EU, and it would be good for NATO. Now, I want to leave the European Union because I believe very simply that a country that doesn't make its own laws and doesn't control its own borders is not a free and sovereign nation. No more complicated for me than that. And on the issue of borders, we sought no change in our renegotiation, so we will get no change in the renegotiation when it comes to control over the free movement of people. And the nonsense that we saw this week over the debacle of the scare story of Calais. I mean, rule number one, if you're going to have a scare story, at least have your ally lined up to back you up in the scare story, rather than pull the rug from under you. But we need to understand that the real threat to our security comes from having a lack of control over our borders. Now, we have seen the flood of migrants into Germany and other countries, and that number may be as high as 3 million by the time we get to the end of this year. And the thing is not just the numbers. They don't know who they are. They do not know if they're genuine asylum seekers. They do not know if they're economic migrants or sympathisers with hardline Islamist causes, or even terrorists under the pretext of any of the above. And when they have been in the European Union for a few years, and that number depends on which country you're in, and they get EU citizenship, they will be able to come freely to the United Kingdom. And we won't know who they are either. And the only way to protect ourselves from that threat is to have complete control of our own borders. And this idea that our European partners will not cooperate with us on issues of intelligence and security if we're outside the European Union is absolutely insane. Why would they want to put themselves at risk by not cooperating with the country with the best intelligence just to spite us for leaving the European Union? Now, really, Prime Minister, on this subject, pull the other one. The Romanians are the establishment campaign in all of this, and I don't mind that they portray us as the underdog, because I'm quite happy to be the voice of the people who've had the voice denied for so long, serially, election after election, by not having a proper debate about European policy. So I believe that we should continue to cooperate with our European partners where it's in our mutual interest to do so, including in security, but be able to act separately when Britain's national interests require it, primarily in the issue of our own national security. And I say that we should be free, we should be strong, but above all else, be in control. Do not believe the Romanians, vote to leave.